I've been taking 1904 as a base year through the course, and it was quite random really, except that for me, Molly and Poldy in bed in June 1904 seemed very symbolic of the problem of relating. But it seems to turn out quite well in that 1904 is a transition year that's very important for what I'm saying tonight. And it is so because in that year there was a sort of a breakdown in physics. I mentioned already 1904 Einstein's 3 papers. Now, why is that important? Because what I'm driving at tonight is the difficulty of understanding. We'll end up in our list of topics with faith and mystery, or at least in section 3 of our list of topics. And the problem is to bring that mood of mystery into our human reality, which is enormously difficult. So 1904, Einstein's discoveries in physics, and a question you can ask yourselves, I've asked you already, it's asked in the books, why is it that we think we are more obvious than, say, an electron? Why do you think that sociology is easier than physics? Because I bet you do. Okay, our list of topics. First of all, we'll do some exercises. Then we'll go back to faith and reasoning. And thirdly, our big section, and one that I've written down already, faith and. And I might as well jot them down because we may not arrive at the topics, so at least you'll have the list and you can work on them during the week. Faith and beliefs. Faith and institutions. Faith and development. Faith and scriptures. Faith and failure. Faith and art. Faith and mystery. That's a decent list. Number 4 is an exercise I had listed last week, 2.5.24 plus process 130 to 131. If you remember, that was the exercise about a family going on holidays. And our final topic, the Christian God and self-discovery. My heavens, that's a terrific list. And it is. I can think of complete courses on some of these topics, or even on pieces of some of these, like art. So we'll see how far we get with this list. Okay, the exercises. The exercise I left you with the last day was the exercise of getting from 5 levels to 4. You'll find at the bottom of page 52 of Wealth that I spell out the moral law, or I don't spell it out, I name it as being attentive, being intelligent, being reasonable, being responsible. And all the time during the course, I've talked about these 5 levels, okay? Do we all remember vaguely these 5 levels of sense? Let's write them down. The level of sense, the what level, the is level, the what to do level, and the amide 2 level. And since there are 3 elements on each of the top 4, you've got the magic number 13. Yeah, are we okay at this stage? You can at least name them. And don't forget, at least in this aspect, this is easier so far than chemistry. In chemistry, you have about 113 elements to remember. A student told me today that in high school, he had to memorize the periodic table of the chemical elements. It's all gone now, of course. But that was the way he did chemistry. Okay, so these are 5 levels, and we discovered those, yeah, by thinking about ourselves and finding that, yes, seeing, hearing, tasting, and then, wow, what's that? And pushing on to check it out. And having checked it out, you ask, well, what am I going to do about it? And having figured out various possible plans, am I going to do this one or that one? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Yeah? Now, what's not obvious is when you're doing it normally, rapidly. The illustration I took was returning a serve in tennis. Okay, so 5 levels. And the exercise I gave you, and it's not in the book, this amuses me, that this is not one of the exercises in section 2.5. And why is it not there? Because it's an exercise in section 6.5, and I haven't put in the exercises there yet. So we're not in the book anymore. Why are there 4 instead of 5 there? And okay, you have the clues, process 100. Now, it's an extremely important exercise, and it takes a lot of imagining to break through on this, and it's well worth thinking about. But don't be disappointed if you don't work this out. And I pause before getting into this exercise on that topic. Some of my students are writing to me or phoning me about the exercises, and they're stuck. Now, some of them may take weeks, and if you don't solve them, it doesn't matter. The big thing is finding out me. Finding out that I am a whatter, okay? And my additional word there is maybe. I won't ask for a show of hands. Many of you have found that you're able to say, I used to be interested in things until I started studying. And it is a shocking thing, and it comes under the question of evil institutions, that some people lose all interest when they start studying. Many of you have had that mood. Oh God, I have to read those 2 chapters tonight. It's quite the opposite of the whatter that you are. There is a sense, of course, in which knowledge makes a bloody entrance. But it's a pity when it's bloody and nothing's entering at all. Okay. So you discover, I am a whatter. Maybe. So some of you are tackling exercises in this section, the 24 exercises, and there are some of the exercises, for instance, exercise 2.5.21 is puzzling some people. I spent a winter trying to do that exercise. I can still remember the winter, the year, etc., and it's pretty tough. It's an exercise that has to do with the notion of thinking in unities. And it's very important if you're going to work out something that's in the footnotes of chapter 1, a philosophy of grammar. What way do we think of objects? In the text I mentioned, for instance, glasses, my spectacles. That's It's plural in English. In German, it's singular, die Brille. So it's one instrument. And you have to realize that you actually think in unities. Sometimes the unities are huge, like the Renaissance, the church. What church? Okay, so don't despair about the exercises. We're at the beginning of a course, which is the beginning of an enterprise. And one of the problems of the despair is that you have been led to believe that human studies are easy. Many of you have that background, that you didn't do brilliantly, say, in mathematics or physics in school, so, wow, I'm not going to do science. Science is heavy stuff. I think I'll do religious studies. Yeah? That's for bird brains. And the entire culture is oriented like that. The notion is that the hard science is physics, and chemistry is a little easier. And botany, well, smell the flowers. And zoology, well, if you can cut up a few dead animals. Okay, now the truth is that the reverse is the truth. Physics is very easy. Chemistry is a little more difficult. Botany is almost impossible. And philosophy is way out. It's too late to sign out of the course. Okay, so you learn a lesson from doing these exercises and not getting anywhere, and that is that this is difficult. Understanding what being human is far more difficult than understanding what an electron is or a quark is. And in 1904 in physics, there was the shock that instead of having it all sewn up, they found we are quite lost. I looked up some of the contemporary books today in physics, and there are a whole legion of particles and a whole legion of partial theories and no coherence. And there's an enormous progress in mathematics and more progress needed to handle the situation in physics. So we don't know what an electron is, and we don't know what a meson is. And that's only a teeny little bit of the human being. Does that make sense? That understanding what a human being is very remote. Okay, and there is a problem with a culture that makes human beings obvious and certain types of scientific study. I keep scientific in the inverted commas, and it should remind you of our discussion last week. Scientific, you're collecting data. You're not getting any insight. And you can do the human sciences like that, and you can do religious studies like that. Now that topic will come up later when we're talking about the family going on holidays. Okay, so that's a word of encouragement about the exercises. You certainly can plunge on your own. You've got the 13 elements named. Exercise them, and exercise them about yourself. You're detecting yourself detecting. And every little insight is marvelous. So there's a sense in which you out there can turn off your television now and get on with the course. But I may be a help, so let's keep talking. So we have this exercise. How do you get from 5 to 4? Now, if you've looked at the sketch on page 100, you will get the clue that this line contains 6 elements. Okay, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And that's a convenient way of writing these. But the reality is much more complex. Now let's chat about that for a little while. These two questions are what questions? What is it? And this is a question, what might it be? Is that a phrase you've used in Canadian English? What might that be? No. Okay, so it's probably Celtic. It's like turning to somebody and saying, would you be after having a cup of tea? Which in Ireland means you're invited to have a cup of tea, which is very reasonable. Then, if you have a cup of tea, you will be after having a cup of tea. Isn't that? Okay. So, asking about the future, you say, what might that be? Like, say, the dinner party tonight, or Friday night, or whenever. You're planning ahead. What might I do for dinner? Fair enough? And that's this question. But there's a way of asking this question which uses the same phrase. Okay? Turn the two into the one question. What might that be? Okay? But one might refers to the future. Okay? What might that be? And one is a colloquial way, certainly in Ireland, of saying, I wonder what that might be. I wonder what that might be. It's not about the future at all. Does that make sense? You hear a noise. Surely there's some equivalent in Canadian English. There's a knock on the door, and you turn to a friend and say, who might that be? Yeah? Is that okay? Can I have a nod from somebody? Yes? Okay. Who might that be? Now, the difference between the two what questions is that in the first case, there is something to what about. You're puzzling about some, let's call it generally, a mess, a collection, a lot of numbers, or a knock on the door. Let's say you're at this great dinner party that we keep talking about, and you have cooked a splendid dinner. And you did it, as I normally do when I'm cooking, complete accident. You mess around until you think, that's nice. And then somebody at the dinner says, well, leaning over the mess, what might that be? Can I have the recipe? Now, that what question is about something that can be tasted and sensed, and it has been put together. Fair enough? Very simple. It's there, in some sense. What might that be? Okay, like my alphabet puzzles, or the dinner. What might that be? What is that? And you say, well, actually, I didn't use a recipe, it just fell together, or I got it in the store. Okay, that's the first what question, number 2. Now, if you look at number 8, it's a what question. The same what about reality, say. But the problem is, it's somehow not about what's there. Yeah? There isn't any dinner yet. It's going to be Friday evening. So if it's something that you've done routinely, well, you can think back, well, I cooked sole bon femme before for this group and it worked. And many of you, when you invite people to dinner, you make a policy of never experimenting. You experiment on your friends, but for important people, you stick with the old reliable, yeah? It worked before, yeah? Crown of roast or beef, whatever. Beef Wellington. Okay, now, but if you're innovating, your what is very much in the dark. What's it going to be? And that's the difference between the two whats. One of the whats has data, we used that word before, and the other one doesn't seem to have the same data. I'm trying to get the difference of attitude here in the same question. It's a what question, it's about possibilities. And the difference is that the one what question has data, background, happenings. It's like doing history. All right. And one what question doesn't have that. This, if you like, is like history. You're doing history. I want a full account of the French Revolution. Then you get the books and you read it up and so on. You mess around and figure out, was it really cakes? Was it a harvest failure? What was it? Now, if you had an essay paper, I want a full account of the decay of the American economy in the year 2011. Isn't that a different sort of question? There's no library to go to. Yeah? The what here regards the future, and there's a sense in which there's a tremendous creativity required. But there is a sense in which somebody who's enormously creative can puzzle forward. I'm thinking of, say, Leonardo da Vinci or people like that, puzzling forward. Okay, let's make it really fantastic. Think of, say, somebody puzzling about iron back in the Bronze Age. You make mixes and eventually you get a metal called bronze, and it's pretty good at breaking stones and breaking heads. And it's inventive, it's experimental, puzzling. Can you imagine this person coming up with a what answer as he swings his great metal sword and saying, this might fly? In the seriousness, not just let fly. Isn't it quite fantastic? Yeah? And there he is, this stone man in his wolf clothes or whatever. He's just invented the airplane. Isn't that good, eh? Okay, it's a leap that seems to lack all evidence. It's like inventing the steam engine before seeing steam coming out of a kettle. Okay, so I'm contrasting these two questions, but also pointing out the identity, that they're both what questions about the real situation as it is developing. Okay? So, as I say, this is a neat way of putting it together into four levels of consciousness. But in fact, one could just as well move those back down here. In other words, the what question is this second level of consciousness. Now you might say, heavens, why did you cheat us all along? Well, you've got to start somewhere. If I was teaching physics, I would not start with Einstein, I would start with Newton. So you have a first level of consciousness, sensibility. The second level is the what level. We are whatters. Okay? And we are whatters about reality in the sense of possibilities. Okay? And it's the same whatting orientation in us. What are the possibilities? Some of you have heard of, say, brainstorming. You're trying to break out of conventional viewpoints. Breaking out of linear thinking, some people talk about. So it's a creative effort, whatting, and it may reach beyond sensibility. Good fiction writers do this. And people who invent are doing this. So they're asking the what question, and they're stretching beyond present sensibilities. Okay, so I get the 5 levels into 4 levels by identifying the 2 what questions as a reach for possibilities. Okay? Now that's going to be very important for us when we get further down to this question of the holiday exercise. So what's the difference then up here? The difference is that this is question asks about this possibility really being realized. Is there really a knock on the door? This is question asks, is this to be realized through me? Am I to do it? There is a possible dinner. Let's say even it's your standard dinner. You always cook chicken Kiev. But the chicken Kiev on Friday doesn't exist yet. It exists insofar as you behave intelligently. Okay? And that's what responsibility means. Now, some of my students have been asking me, what happens after 13? Well, I'm not telling you. As you were saying, you're not telling us everything. No, I'm not. No. We talked about, say, belief. There's a leap, a question that leads to a leap, that leads to a judgment. The leap is 12. The judgment of worth. This person's worth believing. And that's followed by a willingness and a will and a decision. A lot of things follow. So there is, in fact, 13 plus. And you can take it generally as there's a vague group of activities, 14, that we're not doing in this elementary course. And some of them include expression, words, language, and the things that turn up here: scriptures, institutions, art. So you can express yourself inwardly with concepts and outwardly with words. This is pretty obvious when you think of it descriptively. I talked about the moment of illumination of, say, faith. And you have nothing to say except, wow. Many of you have been driven to say something like, wow. Yeah? I hope. Or timidly applaud. Okay. So expression goes beyond these. Now, another topic that I have actually left out very deliberately is a very key element in discussing faith is sin. And let me just hint at the notion of sin. I talked last week about the moral law being you, and morality being you being faithful to your dynamic. And sin is not being faithful, in a very full sense, to your own dynamic. Keep in the context of this dinner party. You work out that, yeah, the intelligent thing to do for my friends is to spend the afternoon putting together a really delightful dinner. And you judge this, yeah, this is what I ought to do. What is worth doing? And you say, well, the hell with it. You withdraw from intelligence. Now, I haven't mentioned freedom at all. I'm talking about a withdrawal from intelligence. Sometimes you get people talking about sin being something that you're free to do. No, freedom Freedom is something that has to do with different plans. Freedom is that you can actually envisage 6 different dinners. I could cook chicken Kiev, and I could cook sole mon femme. And they're all equally splendid. Maybe. Okay, so sin is when you simply back off from yourself. I haven't mentioned the divinity at all. Okay, that's just to keep you exercising your elements. So that's a clue to this exercise of how do you get from 5 to 4. You end up then with the moral law as named at the bottom of page 52. And I asked there, well, do you know what that means? What does it mean to be attentive, to be intelligent? And this is a whole series of exercises, which I will renew when we get as far as art. What is it to be attentive, to be adequately attentive? It's to be superhuman. To be alert, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, balancing. So as to meet all the demands is to be superhuman. And many of you have on occasion said, I should have noticed. See, the sadness in a friend's voice on the telephone. And you just said, yeah, well, I'm busy now. See you next week. Yeah. And then you see, yeah, she jumped off a building that night. Yeah. And in less dramatic instances, I find that it's easier for people to notice when they're the victim of this. You dress up, you dress to kill, as the phrase says, and you go out and you meet the boyfriend, and he doesn't notice a damn thing. Yeah? There you are, you spent a fortune on a bottle of Estee Lauder. Yeah? And he thinks it's a new soap. Okay, or he sniffs and says, gosh, that's a new perfume. You say, oh, yes, I have a cold. I rubbed Vic on my chest. Okay, being attentive is beyond the possibilities of being human. And I'm smiling because this morning I had a great idea of building this lecture around the word may. It might be, you might be attentive, you may be, and you will find when we talk about failure, we're back to my quotation from the book Insight, page 625. I can tell you the page it's on in this. Page 35 of Process. It's a quotation from Insight between a discussion of humor and a discussion of failure, or moral impotence. It's a type of failure. The failure I'm talking about here, in fact, is not moral impotence, but failure in normal human categories, the normal perspective on what is a success. Okay, may. You may be attentive. Now, part of the function of the reflection of reasoning on faith is to open up the may possibilities. May Day, which you may know comes from the French help me. Venez m'aider, I think. And also you can think of the May Queen. Isn't it wonderful to think that in this period where we're stuck with patriarchal speech, that theology was always thought of as the queen of the sciences, the May Queen. I'm thinking of now. Why am I talking about this? Because there's a way in which faith can open up the possibilities of being attentive, of opening up to the other as a mystery. But the question I'm raising here is an exercise in being serious with oneself at the bottom of this page and finding out that, well, I can name the moral law. But what is it to be sensitive, say, to a friend who is a musician? Oh, yeah, I like that tune too. What is it? Oh, yeah, it's Beethoven's 21st Piano Concerto. Yeah, I remember it from Elvira Madigan. Wow. For the person of sensitivity, it's heartbreaking. Like Mahler's Last Word, Mozart. So being attentive is almost an impossibility. Okay, so identifying the moral law in terms of these 4 levels. That was this exercise. Now, heavens above, that's enough for exercises. Let's get back to, or forward to, the topic faith and reasoning. We talked a little bit about it the last day, and we talked a little bit about faith being a conviction, and I want to re-emphasize that because I've thrown a certain number of people with this very broad notion of faith as a conviction. A conviction within the spontaneous subject. Maybe. It seems to go way beyond religions. And the notion I'm trying to get across is that, yes, the convinced person can be faithful to the universe as friendly, provided this is alive. It's not being a member of a church that constitutes you faithful, but being a member of the human race in the sense of, I am still trying to figure out. Now, I know I'm probably annoying a lot of people entrenched in some creed with no openness. Insofar as your conviction doesn't ground a puzzling of how I fit in the universe, it's a suspect conviction. And I'm not talking now about, say, religious groups particularly. I'm thinking at the moment actually about a mafia hitman, a heroin mule, a member of a political party. Are you really that convinced about it? And are you still puzzling? Or are you a member of that party because your daddy was a member? So, conviction. Now, I'm going to move from that general discussion of conviction to a discussion from now on, basically, of Christian faith. For 2 reasons. First of all, it's sufficiently known, its apparent development, its ups and downs. And secondly, most of the people in our group are within that tradition, certainly within the Hebrew Christian tradition. Okay, now let's get back to that question of faith and reasoning and add a few small points. First of all, why am I using this phrase instead of the title of the course? You've got faith and reasoning instead of reasoning and religious belief. I'm using this because the way I talked about faith, faith is prior to even talk. I talk now about expression. if you jump into a conviction, you may say, wow, but you may not say anything else. Okay? You're up in the Himalayas. You see the sunrise or whatever. You see a waterfall. You see the Grand Canyon. There's a shift. And there may not be what's called belief. Okay, so I talk about faith as some sort of conviction. How does it relate to reasoning? Last day I talked about faith or conviction as spontaneously. This is a very difficult question because our spontaneity is so warped, and we'll talk more about that in the next couple of days. But insofar as the spontaneity is healthy, the faith will seek understanding. What happened to me? And last day I talked about those in terms of 7, let's call them properties. Not the word props, that refers to previous discussion. All right, let's call it qualities that I pulled out of a man called Heiler. That you're seeking understanding, and part of it is that, yes, there's something transcendent about the universe and personal. And yet it's intimate. Now, you may not, that push for understanding may be an embodied understanding. It still may not be words. A simple illustration of that is the jump in a culture that invites the community to set up what is called the magic circle. You have a ritual dance, say round something or merely cutting off a space, and it represents for you what's called the sacred. You probably, the North American Indian tradition includes this sort of thing. You find it in the Bushmen. It's a widespread cultural phenomenon. And it's an expression of faith. You've all seen, say, films of that sort of tradition of a circle dance, cutting off a sacred space, that sort of thing. And that's faith-seeking understanding, and it's still not words. Now, Heiler gives very elementary qualities here for that. Okay, faith-seeking understanding in the Christian tradition is something that has led to what's called a development of doctrines, and we'll get into that shortly. But you have an attitude of faith-seeking understanding. You're convinced, it's unshakable, and you want to know, well, what's going on? And what I emphasized the last day was that this reaching is scientific in the best sense, in our sense, and it's not scientific in the other sense. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you're trying to understand, you're not looking for more information. Or if you are, it's information that will help you. A relevant bit of information. Okay? When you're trying to understand, and again, our analogy is puzzling as we did it in the beginning of the course. There's a sense in which you had to be believers to tackle some of these puzzles. Is that fair enough? Take the crossword that some of you are still having marvelous fun over. I love giving out further clues to my students about the crossword, the cross over the hammer. I could have made up those clues and had no answers. Isn't that fair enough? Yeah? Couldn't I? Yeah? So there's this crossword in the book, and I just thought up these nice phrases, and I didn't have any answers. And I have you people slaving away. I think that's a terrific idea. Okay, so there was faith seeking understanding. But you're not looking for more information. You're any little clue, it has to be right on. You're seeking understanding. And it's that process whereby you want this to happen. Now that's scientific in the best sense. And what I emphasized the last day in the last 5 minutes was that Christian prayer in our time has to take a turn towards understanding. Okay, now I'm not saying that what is called negative mysticism, negative prayer, silent prayer is not good. Okay, and let me put then my second, I have 3 pieces of symbols to give you for your reflection. There's faith seeking understanding. There's faith resting. And it's very much connected with is resting. There are 2 attitudes of faith, and they don't exclude each other. But I would say that faith resting always without this one is not entirely healthy. It may be okay for isolated monastic traditions. What do I mean by faith resting? You have the is of faith, the conviction. I know that my Redeemer liveth. I will rest in their presence. From now on, when I'm talking about God, I will regularly use the plural. You'll find, some of you are reading the little book, Music That Is Soundless, you'll find that that runs right through it. It wasn't, when I thought it up, it wasn't connected with feminism, but certainly it gets me out of the problem of saying he or she. The divinity is they in the Christian tradition. So you don't have the problem of male-female. So you are resting with them, and the rest may be either a static stasis, contemplative, a presence, a contentment. I think of Julian of Norwich, all thing is well, all manner of thing is well, see, and she has the vision of the world as a nut in the divine care. That's resting. But you can also have a resting that is ritually expressive. I mentioned the ritual dance. The Catholics may think of the ritual of saying the rosary. There's hymn singing. So the resting needn't be physical, but it's a resting in the basic sense that you are not striving for understanding. Okay, so you have faith resting in normal prayer patterns. Now, it's worth thinking out this question of whether your resting is resting really in a presence, or whether you're just rolling through the ritual. There's a way in which one can prolong into adulthood and middle ages and so on, patterns of prayer that address the divinity without talking to anyone. You were taught to say your prayers. There's a way in which you're not actually in conversation. And that's why I tend to think that this has to be balanced out with this attitude of faith, that you're actually interested in the lover. Doesn't that make sense? As I expressed it irreverently the last day, who the hell are you? Now, you'll get illustrations of this when you move back into the zone of normal friendship. You may find that your friendship, or so-called friendship, no longer is a reach in wonder, but it's a resting which is false. There's a rhythm of daily goings-on, and neither partner is reaching towards understanding. The relationship has passed away, but it's carried on. Okay, so faith-seeking understanding, I would think, is one of the vitally necessary elements in the Christian tradition moving into the next century. It is not a common effort. And that reach is both prayerful and scientific in the best sense. Faith resting, and there's the good quality of that. You can rest, say, with your Bible, with your sacred book, and you're in a presence, and all things are well. And now there's a third attitude that reverses. Understanding, seeking faith. Now that third attitude is, I mentioned that some of these points are topics in other courses. That in fact is the topic of the, I would call it the sister course. The course Philosophy 206, Does God Exist? Which happily you don't have to do. Understanding, seeking faith. But I will bring out a point that is related to our work here, and that is that the understanding, seeking faith, has to be of the same orientation as the conviction of faith. The subject must obviously be convinced that there's something worth searching out. Okay? So there's a conviction. Now, in a more complex discussion of this, one might begin to think that the conviction is, in fact, faith, going back to what I've been saying already, and that it follows, is it St. Augustine who says, we seek thee because thou hast already found us. So that you're puzzling out the existence of God, and that puzzling can be successful insofar as the puzzling is about you puzzling and getting insight. There's a sense in which one can twist the question, does God exist? Do I desire? What are the measures of my desire? And you can see perhaps the difficulty of this from our talk about scientific studies, memorization, the killing of desire, the dead children we talked about last week, that there may not be the desire, the loneliness, the longing. St. Augustine says, is there not an abyss in us? And the answer of the 20th century person may be, oh, the hell there is. It's cloaked and hidden over. You'll get some comments on that in the epilogue to Wealth of Self, the loneliness of Harry Haller and Hermine. Okay, so that's the problem of understanding, seeking faith. As I say, it's quite a different topic. Okay, that's revisiting the question faith and reasoning. And now we'll plunge into section 3. And we can't develop these points enormously, but let's touch on a few significant things in each of them. Faith and beliefs, we've already talked a little bit about the higher beliefs. What you think of immediately, perhaps, if we're thinking within the Christian tradition, is the creeds. Beliefs, you've got creeds, which express, in the Catholic tradition, they talk about faith and morals. To be held by all the faithful was the phrase we learned in our catechism. So the creed, the norm, how many of you remember vaguely one of these creeds in the Christian tradition? No? I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven. Yeah, see? Eyes light up. Okay, so you have these creeds, and they are expressions of faith that emerged out of the Christian tradition, puzzling over their faith. What has happened to us? And we will see when we get down here that that puzzling took centuries. Okay. Faith and institutions, we actually talked about that topic a little bit before. You can think of institutions as, say, buildings, conventions. I illustrated it by taking the institutions of dictionaries, the institutions of books on philosophy of science. But what you spontaneously think of in this context are institutions such as churches, religious groups, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the United Church, and so on, the various churches. Now, the problem of institutions is the problem I brought out, I think, in our third lecture from the diagram or the list of terms on page 83. You remember that vaguely? On page 83, I have a list of terms borrowed from Lonergan. And on the top here was capacity and need. And down here, I have the word institution. And also the words role and task. And immediately you run into a problem of the conventional institution not allowing for changes in the institution. It's a setup that isn't oriented towards maybe, might be. Let us try and replace this structure. We are passé. Can you imagine a group of cardinals, particular political party, suddenly sitting around and voting themselves out of existence? Huh? I won't mention any particular parties. The institution tends to be self-preservative in the worst sense. The human subject, we talked about it here in the sense of creativity, what might be, is a reach beyond all present institutions. The capacity and need of each of us goes beyond the structures in which we live. And doubly so if these structures are oppressive, which was the point emerging from a couple of the previous lectures. The notion of science, oppressive. Okay.